Right, today we're going to talk about the French Revolution, and my goal is to give you an overview of the French Revolution so that you can better understand all of the details that we'll be learning as we go along, and then to go over the causes leading up to the revolution. We will address the details of all of the events in later videos. So first of all, I want to provide a timeline to situate this event into European history in terms of what we have already studied. Let's draw our timeline here. And the French Revolution began in 1789, which is a date you should commit to memory. There are so many others that are not worth doing so, but I would call this a very important hub date. And the whole French Revolutionary period went up until 1815. This included the reign of Napoleon. So we're just going to mark on here French Revolution. And what we just finished studying, if we're going to work our way backwards, is the Enlightenment, okay, which we are going to put on here up to just about the French Revolution. Let's just make it simple. Call this the Enlightenment. And easiest just to remember a century marker, the 18th century. And then working our way backwards further, we have the age of absolutism, which is a little bit harder for me to put onto a timeline because there isn't a definitive starting date. Our textbook puts it starting around 1589, if memory serves me correctly, and going up until the mid 18th century where we get the enlightened monarchs. But the reality is that the age of absolutism does keep going, and it's easiest for us just to remember that absolutism developed quite thoroughly in the 17th century. So I like to study the French Revolution at this point in time, skipping over the social and economic history of the 18th century for the moment, because I think that there's a fairly simple math equation using the time periods that we have studied up to this point. So here's the math equation. We start with the age of absolutism, which generated a lot of discontent because this is a form of government that left out representation for the majority of people in countries. So we have discontent with absolutism, plus an era, the Enlightenment, that brought about a lot of new ideas about what government could look like, how countries should serve people. And the result is, in France, a big revolution that overthrew absolute monarchy, guided by the ideals of the Enlightenment. So that's a little bit simplistic. It doesn't take into account all of the causes of the French Revolution, but it helps to explain a bit of them, and we will come back to them a little bit later in this presentation. Next thing that we need to talk about are how historians have divided up the French Revolution into 4 phases as they've seen themes in them. So let's go over those 4 phases. Oh, you know what? Actually, before we go over those 4 phases, I forgot. We need to talk about what ultimately happened as a result of the French Revolution. So I'm going to again take a sort of a big picture simplistic approach here and say, just take a look at the kind of government that France had. So in 1789, France had an absolute monarchy. And over the next 25-year period, it went through a bunch of government changes, which we will go over later. So it started with absolute monarchy, then it had a constitutional monarchy, then it overthrew the king and queen and established a republic, and it had a republic for quite a few years, and then the republic was overthrown by Napoleon, who sort of called himself a republican leader, but then he decided to have himself crowned emperor and became a monarch again, and really he was more like a military dictator, and I know this is a lot of stuff to throw at you, but there's a lot of changes in government. Ultimately, the French Revolution does produce a change that sticks around for a while, and that is in 1815, France became a constitutional monarchy, and this stuck. Okay, so we're talking about a revolution that fundamentally changes the nature of government, and it also does quite a few other things to the social structure and legal system, but we will get to those later on. All right, now we will get to the phases of the French Revolution. So as I was saying, historians have divided the French Revolution into 4 phases, and let's take a really quick cursory look at them. The first phase is called the liberal phase. lasted just a couple of years. And this phase was led by liberals, hence the name, who were middle-class men guided by the ideals of the Enlightenment. And what they accomplished by the end of this era was the transition from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy. They also implemented a number of other reforms, which we will go over later. And those reforms were guided by the ideals of the Enlightenment. Okay. And they did all of this in a rather peaceful manner. This period was not without violence, but by and large, compared to the next one, it was very, very peaceful. So enter the radical phase. Just get some dates on here. Okay. During this period of the French Revolution, more radically minded individuals took over the reins of government. And these individuals were not content with constitutional monarchy. They wanted change that they wanted more democratic change, more extreme change, more radical change. So they replaced the king and queen and established a democratic republic. They also moved away from the capitalist reforms established by the liberals in the first phase and implemented a planned economy. So this period was radical in a couple of ways. It was radical politically, moving towards democracy. It was radical economically, moving to what we would say the economic left, which is socialism. And it was also characterized by a great deal of violence. Let me draw a little picture here. See if you can guess what I'm drawing. Tens of thousands of people were rounded up during this era and shaved by the revolutionary razor, shall we say, executed by the guillotine for being considered enemies of the revolution. All right. The third phase is Directory rule. Directory rule. And ultimately, the radicals in charge of the government during the radical phase were overthrown, and they were replaced by a 5-man executive called the Directory. So France during this time period was still a republic. Those members of the Directory were elected. There was no monarchy, but the Directory tottered along. It was corrupt. It rigged elections. It was not very good at governing. It couldn't resolve the economic problems that had been plaguing France since the 1780s and even earlier. And so, again, I'm glossing over things here. So the Directory did not have staying power. It was overthrown, and the person who overthrew it was Napoleon. So the fourth phase of the revolution is the Napoleonic era. And I was talking about him a little bit on the previous slide. Napoleon at first governed sort of like a Republican leader, but let's keep in mind that he took power in a coup d'etat, meaning he overthrew the government. So he wasn't elected, but he sort of tried to look like a lowercase r Republican leader, and then he crowned himself emperor. So he became a monarch. So how do we characterize this time period? I'm going to throw all that aside and call it a military dictatorship, which is also a descriptor you will see of him in various books. He was a military general. He took over. He made France, or he expanded France's boundaries to the largest they had ever been and have been since during his rule. So that is a quick overview. And now let's take a step back in time and take a look at the causes of the French Revolution. I'm going to talk about 4 categories of causes. And the first one, just give it a number here, we're going to call political. The political cause was discontent with the absolute monarchy. And just so we don't forget these important words, let's just write them down. Discontent with the absolute monarchy. It wasn't just the monarchs at the time who angered people. The discontent began even earlier, especially with Louis XV. But Louis XVI, right here, was not able to resolve any of France's problems. I think he might have been a decent guy, but just wasn't very good at governing. He also took the throne at the age of 20, while his wife here, Marie Antoinette, was 19. So they were young to be governing a major country. So why did people dislike them? One, they couldn't resolve the problems, the economic problems that France was facing. Two, this type of government, absolute monarchy, had just sort of, there's a lot of reasons to dislike it, right? The Enlightenment philosophers had pointed that out. And three, people really hated Marie Antoinette for a number of reasons. One, she was foreign born. She was Austrian. Two, she was rumored to philander with a lot of other men. So putting these two things together, one of her nicknames was the Austrian whore. She also was not good at playing the games of court. She didn't make friends with the right people. She gambled. She spent way too much money. One of her other nicknames is Madame Deficit. So a lot of discontent with the royals. All right, let's take a look at another cause. The second category of causes I'm going to call social. France suffered from an outdated social structure called the estate system. This is a very rigid social structure that not only placed people into social categories, but also assigned privileges or kept privileges away based on where people fell into the system. So there were 3 estates. The first estate is the clergy. Rich or poor, anyone who was clergy was in that estate. The second estate is the nobility. These are people who are generally wealthy, though again, levels of wealth could vary. Key thing is that they had land and they had titles, making them nobles. And then there's the third estate, which was everybody else. And that everyone else meant the bourgeoisie, which is French for middle class, which unlike today actually means people who could have been pretty darn wealthy. Like the bourgeoisie included super wealthy people, super educated people. They just did not have noble titles. This also included the peasantry, who are the rural poor, people who work the land, and the urban poor, people who live in cities. All right, and the clergy and the nobility made up only about 2% of the population, leaving us with 98% for the third estate. And the big problem here is that the clergy and nobility had a number of privileges that were denied to the third estate. And this made the third estate really, really mad. The most significant privilege that the clergy and nobility had was exemption from taxation. So they got the benefits of government, but they didn't have to pay anything to it. And the tax burden fell on the third estate. This cartoon here illustrates the idea that the third estate was very burdened in the era of the French Revolution. So let's just go through and identify each of the individuals. This guy in the back with the lovely curly hair here is the king. Okay, this guy with the bishop's hat represents the clergy. This guy who's never lacked a meal and has this cool little medal down here indicates that he is a noble. And this poor guy on the ground, looking skeletal, wrapped in chains, right, carrying all the other 2 estates and the king on his back, and he's blindfolded, is the third estate, right? So representing the burdens of the third estate. All right, our third category of causes here are ideological. Number 3, ideological. All right, two major events, I don't know if we can call them events, served as guiding ideas for the French Revolution. So the first one here is the Enlightenment. So sort of an event, long time period, right? The ideals of liberty and equality became guiding forces for creating a new government in France. Okay, and the second ideological factor was the American Revolution. The French had sent a lot of people overseas to fight on the side of the Americans against the British And the French soldiers over there were very inspired by this example of the Americans breaking away from a government that they thought was ill-suited to govern them. So they brought those ideas home and applied them in France. And our fourth and final category of causes is economic. First of all, France by the 1780s was suffering from major debt, particularly because of its involvement in wars in the 18th century. Not only the American Revolution, but also the 7 Years' War, which France fought against Britain in the mid-18th century in both North America and in India. And it was this whole big quest to acquire territory, and it got very expensive, and France actually lost that war, but accumulated a lot of debt. So when we look at the French annual budget in the 1780s, we can see that 50% of what the government was spending went to pay just interest on the national debt, so it wasn't going anywhere. 25% was spent funding the military, right? So, and 6%, sort of ridiculously, was spent on Versailles, leaving less than a fifth of the budget to cover the rest of the country. So in 1789, Louis XVI had a huge crisis on his hands. How was he going to repay the debt? And this is how this is where the French Revolution begins. A second economic factor was the fact that there had been poor harvests in the 1780s, which resulted in a lack of bread and then inflation in bread prices, which spread to a wider inflation and also unemployment. So this results in the poor getting filled with unrest because they don't have the fundamental things that they need to survive. And I'm just going to write the term bread riots here because these were an expression of the discontent of the poor. And the poor absolutely play a role in if not starting the revolution, then driving it forward. So there you have it. An overview of the French Revolution and 4 categories of causes.